to the Morris Bookshop. My name is Melynda Price, and I teach at the University of Kentucky. And the folks here at Morris kindly asked me to facilitate a community discussion about Ghosts at a Watchman. And I was really excited to do it, so I came in and I bought the book. And I read 2/3 of it like 3 months ago, and then the last third the last week. But I really liked it. So I should say that I'm a lawyer, and a lawyer who does death penalty work. So To Kill a Mockingbird has been really instrumental fiction in the way I think about the law. And so I'm excited to have a conversation with people about what exactly the book was like. I really liked it. I guess I should start there. I really liked the book a lot. And I'm happy to be with people who are interested in talking about it. So should I start with something I found interesting, or people tell me their thoughts about the book? What did you think? Did you like the book?
I did. So I'm a high school English teacher here in Fayette County. I teach at the STEAM Academy, but I've taught early on in my career. I taught Mockingbird every year to ninth graders. And I got done reading this, and my first thought was, this is really the text we should be teaching. And I just thought kids have such a hard time sometimes getting into the context of Mockingbird. Mm-hmm. And I taught it primarily in Vermont. So you even take it like a step away from the South. And like they have a really hard time just sort of picturing that world.
One of the questions I actually had as I was reading was, would this be a high school classic? Like if this had been published before To Kill a Mockingbird, would this be assigned in every American high school? And I was like, I don't think so.
No, not at all.
I'm not so sure.
And I think you'd have to teach them. I would love to teach them in conversation. Like for me, this could be a semester-long class of Mockingbird and then Watchman, just to see that conversation.
And that's actually what reading Watchman had made me go back to Kill a Mockingbird. And just doing that comparative myself. And I think, like what you were saying, that if this had been the novel that came out originally, I don't think we would even know it today. That I think in the time that Mockingbird came out, that was the novel that could gain some traction and become a classic. And in a way, I think Watchmen is the novel we need now.
Yeah.
To get us into some conversations.
And then, I mean, not even like 20 pages in, I was like, this is what's relevant right now.
It was interesting because Mockingbird is written from the perspective of a child. But in a lot of ways, to me, the community is more vivid. Do you know what I mean? Like as she walks through, there's more color. There's the C.O. Cunninghams and the C.U. Cunninghams. There's that family of mixed race people who they find hard to identify. There's more class stratification. But in a lot of ways, as an adult, they become flattened in makeup, and they become white people and black people. And I think about that as a kind of adult transition into that children see a lot more variety, but adults have to make choices about where their allegiances are. And so, like, just reading both versions, I think together, that if they'd been published in closer proximity, would have been an amazing thing to have been able to do at that time. So, you want to talk like about the writing, what you thought about the writing or the words, or I always like to start talking about the writing, the structure, the words. Like some of the colloquialisms are very sort of dated, but funny in a kind of way. And when she calls towards the end Atticus a ring-tailed SOB, like I love that kind of antiquated language. What did you think about her moving back and forth between the past and the present? And what did you think about the structure?
I found the structure definitely in Watchmen underscored it being a draft that wasn't as worked on. I have a hard time picturing it as a first draft, just because there are such sparks of beautiful portrayals of environment and caricatures of people that I think really resonate beyond what a first or even a second draft would be. I found it a little more clunky and not as polished as To Kill a Mockingbird, but I definitely think it was the humor in it was what really stood out for me. I thought the humor in Watchmen that sometimes came out with those colloquialisms and some of the antiquated language, or what we would call antiquated now, but
was
were
high language of the time.
the language
Very
of the time.
fashionable.
Yeah, that it gave an authenticity to that to Scout's adult voice.
In the beginning, it seemed really romantic, and I was just like, well, I don't know if I'm gonna appreciate this kind of Scout the romantic, like in search of love, and what does that mean? But it did sort of, the tone changed in a way that makes you wonder if it had been edited more, how things might be different.
Yeah.
So, what did you think about the expansion of of Aunt Alexandra's character?
I liked the role that she played.
Yeah.
I thought she was a good sort of antithesis to what Scout wanted to be, but actually had a lot of the same. That it was almost as if Scout was seeing herself on down the road and knowing that was the direction she was going, and having to have that internal conversation still of, is this the person I want to become with that? That I thought she was a great play against Scout.
Did you miss Jim?
Yes. Yeah, I was
did.
crushed more by finding of his death in the first little bit. Versus.
So I miss Jim because he was like not just her partner in crime, but he was her sensible side. So I'm a twin, so I grew up in tandem with another person. So I know what it's like to allow yourself, like to grow up with someone who can take on the parts of yourself that you're not as capable in. And so I was like, I wonder what it would have been like to see, instead of her watching Hank or Atticus mature, but to see Jim, who really is her twin to a large degree, to see him become a grown-up sort of white man in the South, you know? Like, it's easy to be angry with Atticus as a kind of fading day, but what would it have meant for Jim to have been present? Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think that would be one of those things too, with more editing at the time, maybe it would have grown into something more.
There's some hints that Jim sort of takes a path in contrary. Remember, he says he starts slicking his hair back and dating girls, and he's drinking and driving around from town to town. And so you're like, what is happening with Jim at the time? You know, he goes off to the war and he comes back. So is it like post-traumatic stress syndrome? Like, what has happened in Jim's life before he died that I think it would have been good to know? I would have wanted to know more of, you know? So.
In a way, though, I also think that's what sort of pushes Scout to really begin taking these things on, because you know, he was next to Atticus that sort of figure for her, who, you know, sort of affirmed, yes, this is what, you know, this is where I should go, this is what I should believe. And so I think his absence is really important to where Scout is finding herself and where she's seeing herself. But it was very interesting at first to sort of wrap my head around that piece that she's not going to be.
So now that we've taken a roll call, I'm trying to think who Calpurnia.
There are some, in reading some of the reviews, who have said that they thought if she would have been a bit more defiant towards Scout, it would have elevated the novel more. And I'm not sure where I stand on that, because I kind of like I like her reserved response
Yeah.
to Scout, and that
She's still living in Alabama.
exactly.
And the time that she is living in, right? I mean,
Right.
she is, I don't know what more defiant she could have taken
Yeah.
and still have it be believable, given who Jean Louise Finch was as an adult white woman in that community.
Right.
So I thought of it, I was trying to think about what did it mean. We try to exceptionalize people who work with children to say that somehow their work is more emotional. And I think at the time, the immediate time they are with children, that might be true. But then I thought to myself, what if I had retired and my work showed up at my house, right? So I'm in the midst of a family crisis, and I teach at the law school. And the law school, if it had a human manifestation, showed up at my house and asked me to take care of it in some way. How would I feel? What would be my response to that? And to some degree, that's sort of what's happening to Calpurnia. Her family is in a real crisis, and Scout shows up, and she's like, "Can you take care of me? Can you, help me, do this work that you have been doing for years, even as you are old,
Yeah.
So, I don't know. So, we talked about the structure. We've done our little roll call on the characters. I'm trying to think, did we miss anyone? Hank. Dude, I didn't remember him from the first book. He wasn't in the first book? Okay, good. Because I was trying to remember all the other children and who were around.
He came on this scene sounds like after.
Yeah.
After Dill sort of,
Poor Dill.
petered out.
Yeah. Which is the way
I
that
miss Dill too. I was
Yes.
I think that would have been fascinating.
his stories.
Piece just
Yeah.
to see. Yeah.
It's almost like that one part with the flying machine was like a scene they kicked out of Mockingbird
Right.
and just put in here. And I was like, okay. So, yeah. So I have all these things that I have written down, like place and home and family and confrontation and hauntings and is Atticus Finch a good person? And so we can start with sort of any of those questions. The biggest thing I think that people seem to be responding to was their concerns about the denigration of the Atticus Finch character, right? I mean, people were really angered by this. Mm-hmm. They said, how dare you turn Atticus Finch into this member of the white city, this racist in this new book? And I just kept thinking to myself, Atticus Finch was the least egregious upholder of white supremacy in Alabama in To Kill a Mockingbird. Like, I don't understand where in our minds, how all of us who have read this book, we got the idea that somehow Atticus Finch was like a person a racial progressive. I don't know where people got this from. You teach high school students. Do they read it that way as well?
Well, what really ticks me off actually is a lot of them read it in middle school. And
that's inappropriate.
Teaching it in middle school, just no. I'm sorry. I know Scout's like young, but stop teaching it in middle school. Sorry, middle school teachers.
Yeah.
No. I think for me it goes back to the whole conversation on privilege and on race relations and how we have to make things black and white. And I think that when we read To Kill a Mockingbird, I think one of the reasons why it was definitely so successful is because it's a safe read. We can look at Atticus Finch and we can say, this is a great, upstanding, moral person. He's standing up against racism, and we can overlook the smaller places where it's obvious that he has been raised in this system. And I think that's what's really troublesome about his portrayal in here, is that it's what we're seeing is the real person.
Yeah.
we're seeing somebody who, yes, does believe in justice and is willing to stand up for, and this, channeling somebody's review of it. It may be Chris Bajalian's. But we're seeing somebody who absolutely cares about justice and doesn't want to see a miscarriage of justice in the case of Tom Robinson, but who still is a white man living in the South in the first part of the 20th century. And so to be really honest about who he is, even if he is the least egregious of the men in this system, he's absolutely, he is still part of it, you know, and that's, my struggle is, you know, does that turn him into somebody who is morally bankrupt and corrupt and evil, or is it still possible to be a good person and a good father and to teach moral values, but still have your own flaws?
The two things from what you said, which I love, by the way, that I want to push on just a little bit. But one is, did Atticus believe in justice or did he believe in the law? Because those are two very different things. And Scout is really the one who, Jean Louise, is really the one in her confrontation with Atticus. I mean, the importance of that White Citizens Council meeting is not that what the person says necessarily, but it's the way it rips away the veil between the child and the woman looking at her father, right? So did he believe in justice or did he believe in law? And can children really see their parents, you know, to any large degree, you know?
Yeah, and I think I would definitely say that Atticus, and a closer examination, even in Mockingbird, he believes in the law.
Yeah.
And that I think what Watchman does is flesh out that complexity of human nature, that it can be someone who has these part of his belief in upholding the law, could be championed by a certain set. But I think with the complications that Watchman introduces, it asks us to examine ourselves, that, you know, who we are is more than just one thing or the other.
And also in Watchmen is the first time we begin to see the law shift away from Atticus's values, right? Because when he and Scout are talking about the Constitution, they really are having a discussion that's more apropos for Reconstruction. But it's not until we get to that point that it's the first time that the law actually goes against what Atticus believes should be the natural order of things. You know, it's all of his life. One of the things I love about this book that you can't do with a book where children are the protagonists is that you're allowed to travel far most of the time. So she goes to New York, and she takes us from sort of the confines of the early Finch home, which is now an ice cream parlor owned by the Cunninghams, which I love. And we go to Finch's Landing, right? Because when you're a child, children are not connected to family history. But as an adult, she goes to Finch's Landing. And as soon as she shows up at Finch's Landing, we all know what that means, right? What this house means, what it means in terms of their connection to Black people means. Like, it clarifies that this is maybe a family that has become more professional now, but is an old landed money family in Alabama. And that means that these people's hands have been involved in slave holding and slave owning for a very long time, because that property has just left the family hands in recent years at the time Watchman is set, right? We would not have known that. Atticus Finch sits in a kind of historical isolation, but now he has a genealogy, you know, that he is now integrated into the history of the South in a way that you get to exceptionalize him because he stands up for Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird. You go to New York, you go to the Junction, And they spend all that time in the beginning talking about how Macomb is settled and the war with the Creek Indians. And the only time they talk about slavery is with Uncle Jack, who's making light of it in his explanation of who Atticus is as a human being, you know. But you can't do that with children, necessarily. You know, even if she went back to Finch's Landing, it would be for swimming or for family reunions.
Well, yeah, and they do. They go back that one time with Francis, whoever. Yeah, they just get in they just get in a fight.
Yeah, just get into a fight. So, I don't know.
Well, even the piece about the Citizens Council meeting, you know, and I think that's very telling of us as readers, as people in our communities and our societies, how much we do want to grasp for that idea that, I forget if it was Jack or Alexander or Hank, but one of them put forward that, well, Atticus didn't say anything, but he had to let the guy speak. And it's like, I so want to believe that. I so want to believe that, because that's who Atticus Finch is in Mockingbird. But because of all the other information that we're given, I can't, within myself, I can't let that be the simple excuse to just go ahead and keep, you know, keep Atticus on that pedestal. Like, I have to deal with him as a real complex character and human being.
So I had this question about what is the meaningfulness of to move away and come back? Because I write about Texas, but some of the things I write now or that I noticed, I would not have noticed if I had not moved away. You know, like when I went back to do the research, I had been living away for 5 years. Yes, I've been living away for about 5 years. So how did you take that? How important was it that Scout had not just gone to college? Because she went to a women's college in Georgia, so it's not like she would have gone to a place where the ideology is radically different than her hometown. But she goes to New York, and in New York, she comes back, and people think that this is an important difference. How important is it to go away and come home? To see home from a distance is better.
And that's
see home from a distance.
That's just a really fascinating question. I'm trying to find, there's a whole passage where she talks about it. But yeah, I mean, just, and again, you know, I'll be completely honest. You know, I grew up here. My family, all my extended family is from the Northeast. So I spent quite a bit of time in Vermont in the summers, but still, I went up there for college, and then I stayed up there to teach. And so it really was coming back here where I began. One, honestly, if you'd asked me in college or even afterwards, you know, I would have been like, I don't know what people are talking about. There's no real racism in Lexington. We're a progressive city. And then I came back at, 27 after working up there, and I started, I was subbing in the schools, and I was out and about, and I just kind of went, holy mackerel, we still have a lot of issues with segregation, self-imposed or not. I mean, we have issues around these lines, and it even made me more aware. I mean, let's be honest, I went to like one of the 5 whitest states in the nation.
That's true.
So, that's where I come back, and again, it's like, I've not been around so many people of color for so long that I also have to sort of, reset my clock. I think I became aware of just unacknowledged biases that I wasn't even aware that I had or I harbored, and those moments of like catching myself and like, whoa, what's going on here? Why, and having my perspective in a way questioned.
Yeah.
Going, hey, maybe I don't know. Maybe there's a lot that I don't know. And that was the kicker for me, and I think that's part of it for Scout too, is is struggling with that because I can't find it, but there is that passage where she's this stream of consciousness talking about how she doesn't like New York, and New Yorkers are rude and they're hateful and they're judgmental, and I just want to come, I'm going to come back to the South, and then all of a sudden.
And as Uncle Jack mentions, they're also not perfect when it comes to race. He
Oh,
asks
yeah.
her, he says, how many interracial couples do you see in New York City? He's like, if this is just a foil, he's basically trying to decry that myth, but he's also pointing out, like, look, you live in New York, where it's true that there are all these people of color who may not be treated quite the same as we do here in New York, but New York is no utopia.
Yeah, and you can live in one of the whitest states in the nation and be like, oh look, we don't have any problem. Well, yeah, because we don't have any diversity. I mean, what.
So.
Well, and that's one of the things that I look back on my own experience, having grown up in small town Eastern Kentucky, that I encountered no persons of color in elementary school, in middle school, not until high school.
Where was that person? Where had they been all your life?
That was the thing. That it was, for me, it was, I look back on that experience, and that within that, growing up in that world, I didn't think anything different of it until I came to Lexington to go to college, to go to, undergrad at Transylvania, that it was like, oh, okay, this is more, and so, started some of the questioning then. So even now, I look back on that upbringing as, how complicit am I in things, and having those same moments of recognizing your privilege.
Yeah.
And being able to wrap your mind around it, coming from a perspective of privilege, that it's like, what am I not seeing, or what am I seeing?
This is the least ethnically diverse place I've ever lived. I grew up in Houston. I went to university in Ann Arbor, which is just outside of Detroit. I lived in Austin, which is not as racially diverse as people think, but certainly different than here. I went to a historically black college that was in pretty much an all-black town. And so but the school itself actually had about 15% non-black students. So it's sort of interesting when you encounter, I also grew up in the Rim South, as they like to call it. It's called Texas. And this is a different kind of South than I grew up in. So I think it's always interesting to ask, where are you coming from? Right. Like what does it mean to come to a place, and what are you bringing with you,
Well, and I will say this really resonated. My mom read it after I read it.
Okay.
And it's a little known fact, I was actually born in Birmingham, Alabama. I lived there for all of 6 months of my life. I have no recollection of it.
But now
again,
yes.
and my mom was just talking about how, this was for her, it brought back a lot of moving to, again, being a Yankee, white woman, blonde hair, blue eyes, moving to Birmingham in the mid-70s. And just having to, and she was a social worker in mental health and doing all this social services, and just having to really try to wrap her head around, what it meant to be white in that city, and to, think, oh yeah, sure, I can go wherever I want. There's, there's no danger, but to see danger because of the racial tension, and to try to figure out how to navigate that system. It's really fascinating conversations.
So I'm going to redirect us just a little bit.
I wanted to
go ahead.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting parts of this book for me was that when it opens, Scout, she's returning to, and it's been probably 15 plus years since I've read To Kill a Mockingbird, but she's returning to Macomb County, and then as a reader, we're also returning because we have this idea of Macomb from To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh, that's
and
true.
It's attached to what we think about Atticus, and there's all these perfect, things about Macomb that we believe. And Scout, she still sees Macomb. I think at that time, she's looking at it from, her childhood eyes. And so we get there, And right along with Scout, as a reader, we start to realize that it's not perfect. This town, she realizes these things, and as a reader, we realize, actually, it wasn't this perfect town that we imagined. But once we get, but she has this love for her town. And then even when she realizes it's not perfect, because there's that section where she starts talking about, she's not into the change, Scout. She wants her father to stay 50.
Yes.
She looks at she's
not that keen
wants
on,
all
on the
these
new
little
house.
things that may come to say the same, and she also wants the federal government to leave her state alone, but at the same time she she kind of struggles with wanting with the change that's happening, and then with what she thought it was when she was a kid. She really wants it to may come to stay the same as it was when she was, however old she was in To Kill a Mockingbird. That's the may come that she, that she wants.
So you're saying we're all going back to this place, to
right.
the home that has been created. That's good. So one of the things I want to talk about is a little bit is the way that class plays out differently for adults than children. Because I think one of the things, being people who have a connection to the South, or if you identify as a Southerner, which I do, is that people always want to portray poor people in the South as the big racist. Like they're like, look at this poor white person. Like somehow all of the racism in the South can be lumped into lack of education and lack of wealth. And Atticus makes clear that that's not the case, which I think is interesting, because when you look at eugenics movements and when they would have been popular in the 1920s and 1930s, they were really a kind of ideology of intellectuals. And intellectuals in the South bought more into those ideas than working class people, because they were forced into a different kind of interaction because of their class status. So I want to talk a little bit about this, because Jean Louise, there's this section that I marked that I wanted to read, where she is talking about Aunt Alexandra. And I love the way they call her Zandra, which is such a Southern thing to do. And now I have friends who are just named Zandra. And I want to be like, who's the Alexandra? She said Alexandra was one of those people who had gone through life at no cost to themselves. Had she been obliged to pay any emotional bills during her earthly life, Jean Louise could imagine her stopping at the check-in desk in heaven and demanding a refund. And I want to think, like, she's talking about her as a privileged person, but not herself, right? And I want to talk a little bit, like, we don't have the Cunninghams here. We're not in the Depression. So we don't have that kind of portrait of need in the same way. And I was wondering how you thought about the difference in the way that class is working itself through in this book. There's so much of this that could only be experienced by people of means, right? That she's home on vacation in the 60s, in the late 50s, I think it is actually, on vacation for 3 weeks or something. And she came by train all the way from New York City. I wonder if you had thought about the small ways that, like in To Kill a Mockingbird, we get to see what that means. And if anyone takes a stance, changes, right, and does not act on what we think should be their expected sort of racist role, it's the poor mob of white people who turn and go home in To Kill a Mockingbird. One scout sees them and says, "Hi, Mr. Cunningham and Mr. So-and-so." They turn around and they go home. But here, we don't have them here. We just have sort of upstanding members of the community. Uncle Jack is a doctor. Hank and Atticus are lawyers. Alexandra is at least the wife of a professional man. Her friends who come over are the wives of professional people. These are not, there's not one poor person. Even Mr. Willoughby, I think, who, in the courthouse crowd, who had started out being an enforcer, but now could barely remember those days and is a good upstanding member of the middle class community. What did that make you think about? Because I cringe at that portrayal of poor white Southerners a lot, as if they are the problem in the South. And I wondered if you had thought about that as well. So, do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, well, I
What
mean,
I'm trying to get us to talk about a little bit.
what's interesting is that I think this is kind of the same thing that Jean Louise is struggling with.
Yeah.
Because it is that passage at that dinner. Here's the teacher on me on page 177, where she and Hester are going back and forth everywhere, about the idea of intermarriage and all of this, and Jean Louise says, I've heard a great deal of talk about mongrelizing the race, and it's led me to wonder if that's not a rather unfortunate phrase, and if it probably should be discarded from Southern jargon these days. It takes two races to mongrelize a race, if that's the right word. And when we white people holler about mongrelizing, isn't that something of a reflection on ourselves? And they sort of go on and, Hester, are you insinuating? Oh, I'm sorry, said Jean Louise. I didn't mean to do that. I beg your pardon. Jean Louise, when I said that I wasn't referring to us, who were you talking about then? Well, I was talking about the trashy people, the men who keep Negro women and that kind of thing. Jean Louise smiled. Well, that's odd. 100 years ago, the gentlemen had colored women, and now the trash have them. And the response is, well, that's when they owned them, silly. No, the trash is what the NAACP's after. I mean, for me, that's right there is. And she's not there yet. I mean, that's what she's struggling with, is how do I...
It's like, this is some vacation.
but where am I complicit in this? Because again, we are sitting around here talking, and let's look at the ways that we keep changing the values to make sure that we're in the right.
The right.
It just,
Yeah, and I think the absence of the poor white within Watchman makes the reader focus on, that's an eliminated part of the question now.
Yeah.
You've really got to focus on you and your own privilege, which is what Jean Louise is doing with herself. So it's almost as if within here, Lee is pulling the reader into align with Jean Louise and go, I need to examine the same things
figure
and
this
take
out.
a look at
What
that.
does this what does this mean for me? What does this mean if she's going to marry Hank and go settle back down in Alabama? What is
And she hasn't figured it out yet, because they're almost having a similar conversation when she confronts Atticus. I can't remember if it's Atticus or Uncle Jack now, actually. And it must be Atticus, because they're talking about why is the Negro in the situation they're in now, which is to some degree a conversation we're having right in this moment. Like, even when they talk about, she was like, who is Zebo gonna be mayor? Calpurnia's son? Is he gonna be mayor? I mean, are we gonna allow these people to take over? They could have had better, right? With no acknowledgement of the ways in which the sort of white power structure undermined public education or used their labor in certain ways. I mean, there's like so many places where you can see the silence, which is not easy to do in a creative text, so not easy at all. So I got tons.
Yeah.
What about the confrontation with Atticus and Scout? It made me kind of tense just reading it. So, because what was Atticus to say? What was she to do, So, I don't confront my mother as a rule.
She did exactly what Atticus wanted her to do, which was to take him off a pedestal.
Yeah.
So, and to be her own person.
It must be exhausting for Atticus, to have to be that person forever, So, but what did you think about that confrontation?
I found it very uncomfortable but also very necessary. With it, like you said, to remove Atticus from this pedestal, to remove that mantle
Yeah.
that he's carried of being, the moral ground for
Yeah.
American literature. That was a very necessary conversation.
I never thought about it that way, but it is helpful.
Yeah.
Like the whole discussion of why Atticus Finch is not who we think he is, I think is a useful one,
Well, and I think it exposes how oftentimes conversations we may have publicly differ from those
That's right.
we have privately.
That's right.
And that's some of the hardest things
Yeah.
for us to really look at, and probably the things we should most look at
Yeah.
within ourselves.
Yeah. Because we talked about race. We haven't talked about gender really, because Scout, it's a different thing. Like the questions we ask about race can be, they're not exactly the same. It can be paralleled for women once they marry, right? So the loss of citizenship and identity at this time for women, marriage meant that you were really giving up a lot in terms of your own individuality. So what did you think about the questions of gender? Like Scout spends her whole childhood trying not to be a girl. And then they have that scene where Mincy's sets on and she's just like, oh, so I'm not a boy,
Well, and I think there's those challenges
Yeah.
still continuing in Watchman with
Yeah.
Scout as an adult, and I think that's her clashing with Alexandra.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that she sees Alexandra as that married, full Southern genteel lady,
Yeah.
and that she's questioning that, and that's still some of that conversation she's having with herself.
And there is a tenderness towards the end where Alexandra changes because she knows exactly what Scout is confronting. It's like she's sitting there and Scout is like, I know what you're going to say. And she doesn't say any of the things Scout thinks she's going to say because she knows what it means to come from a family of privilege and then having to depress your own personality, suppress your own personality in order to be this wife and then have it not work out in the ways that you imagine, Am I the only one who had to read it multiple times to figure out that Uncle Jack hit Scout in the driveway? Did you, at the end, did you have to read it multiple times? I was like, what happened? Why does she have cuts on her lips? And then I went back and read it
I didn't
again.
do that, but I also read a
okay.
review that talked about, something with the domestic violence. And
I don't think it was
Okay.
blatantly obvious with
Oh,
those,
okay.
that I did go back.
I was like, hey, what happened? Is that a dated thing that happens in the book? Like, would that have been written differently? Do you think if that book had been written now?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because I tried to figure out if Harper Lee had the capacity to sit down and work on this novel now, what would she keep and what would she remove? And I wondered if that was one of the things, because even Uncle Jack says, look, hitting women is no easy business. And, you have to be the person, if you don't do it all the time, he says. And I thought to myself, wow, this is a very different understanding. She also mentions that when he finds her smoking and he beats her, she says, he spanks her so that she won't do it again. And we don't, I want to talk a little bit about that as a kind of question of how we relate to our intimates in a different way. Had you thought about that? I was like, whoa, like what does that mean?
Well, I think that like the misogyny and the gender relationships, I think, is one of those areas that without the additional focus and editing, it's sort of almost sort of there, but not completely there. So I think it doesn't get the space that I think it could have.
Yeah.
had this undergone some focus editing and really develop it to the potential that it has. Because I think most readers would still identify Scout as a feminist character with that, and just with some attention to that. I think that there are parts of it that are lost within the clumsy writing at times. With
Yeah,
that,
well,
could have been
that was a
brought
part
out.
that was problematic for me, and part of it was I just felt, and maybe I'm just again wanting to make people better than they are.
Yeah.
It seemed almost a little inconsistent in that piece. I was kind of like, why did he go off and do that? Like, it
Or
seemed like
how-
their relationship
maybe
was
the
much
nature
more.
of her hysteria was not written very
Yeah,
well.
it was.
Right?
Yeah,
So-
I don't know.
Yeah. Let me check if I got into all my questions.
But I will say for once, I was ticked off that Atticus was right. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it goes
Yeah.
back to that idea of the patriarchy that, after Scout, Jean Louise, goes and just lays into him,
Yeah.
he's like, yeah, you did exactly what I wanted you to do. And I was like, what? I was really like, damn, why does he have to be right?
It was almost like a pat on the head after all that
Yeah, it was-
maturation. It was
yeah,
like,
and I'm
good job.
just-
You
what?
did
No,
exactly what I wanted you to do. Thank you very much. And I wonder where she would have gone from there.
Yeah.
Like when she went back to New York and she came back, or she came back and she married Hank, what would have happened? What would have been what would have been Jean Louise Finch in Scout in Macomb County's life have been? Married to Hank. I can't remember what his last name was now. Like, any other favorite parts that you like that we haven't discussed? I like the networks of small towns. The way when she goes skinny dipping, by the time she gets home, everyone knows it. So I grew up in a very large city, but sometimes Lexington's the smallest community I've ever lived in. And sometimes it's interesting the way people will be like, I know, heard so-and-so, and you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then you realize that, like, oh, this small thing happened to you. It was really small, but somehow it has made the rounds in your small community that you live in. And I wondered if you had thought about those.
Yeah, I think
I like that scene a lot. So thank you for coming.
Thanks. I think the whole
Yeah.
capturing that small town
Yeah.
was one of the most rewarding things with this, and I think it was something that was well done in To Kill a Mockingbird. But here, I think it stands out even more, and it may be because the other pieces of it literarily may fall down, whereas that piece of it stands out.
I asked this question early on about structure, but I love the way in the White Citizens Council speech, Mr. O'Hanlon's speech, the way it almost reminds me a little bit of Faulkner. Now, I'm no literature person, but the kind of stream of conscious way she's writing, like she's skipping all of these sentences, but we follow her immediately. I love that notion that it would have been not as interesting to read pages and pages of some screed about the differences between the inferiority of Black people, but instead she gives us these snippets, and it's almost like slogans of the day. Forehead. We should say their brain pans. She's like, what even does that mean that they have a limited brain pan, or all of those things? So that was one of the interesting pieces of writing I thought I would point to. So the last question I had was, what does it mean to mature in a changing world? Like, we have all these kids who are coming of age right now in a world that's clearly, the world never stays the same, but it seems like the sort of points of evolution move faster in certain moments than they do. So I'm guessing that our ages are not too far apart. So we grew up in a kind of period where the world was relatively stable for a while. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union came down, but there was no not a huge amount of change, but I feel like we're in a moment now where young people are maturing in a period where the world has picked up pace just a little bit. And Jean Louise is actually in that moment then. The NAACP is in makeup, in their views, to make trouble, but clearly there is a good reason for the NAACP to be present there. So I was wondering if you had thought about, like, what kind of thoughts did the book leave you with? And that was my big question. What does it mean to mature in a world that's changing, you know? So, but what were your sort of big thoughts about the book? What were you left with?
One thing that I was left with along the lines of looking at youth who are growing up now and the relationship it has to Scout growing into Jean-Louis and what she's encountering was, I don't know how it happened, but it did, that I had read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me before I read, like immediately before, and I found it to be such a like a mind explosion to read the two together.
Yeah.
That it was
also written to his son.
Exactly.
So it's aimed at a young person.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's that conversation between generations.
Yeah.
That is almost a recognition when the older generation has come to understand something, to go ahead and share that with the youth, and is that part of what expedites that growing up?
Yeah.
Or is it growing up in that time of change that expedites that?
One of the things that I'm seeing now, and I also noticed in To Kill a Mockingbird that is true, I think is also true, this Coates book, is that to some degree Ta-Nehisi Coates is trying to figure out how to make sense of the world in a non-religious context.
Yes.
So he's struggling because, like I tell people all the time, I'm an ethnic Christian, because there's a way that to understand myself as a Black American is also to understand myself in the Black church and Black Christian tradition, even if I'm not fully engaged in it, which I wasn't for a very long time. So but what saves him, and which is true of Jean Louise, because I got the sense in To Kill a Mockingbird and here that they're really just going to church for presentation's sake.
Yes, yes.
And so they're into the ritual because it's not the spirituality that they're going there for. But all of them are saved by books and reading and literature. And that there's something important and meaningful in educating yourself. Like this family's sort of intervention or this driving this catharsis for Scout could not have happened if they were not people who had been thoughtful about and had read a lot and done all these things. So the meaning of books in the lives of young people. Remember, she talks about how Atticus read to them from whatever he was reading at the time. And that was just really powerful, you know.